Please be sure to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and hit the bell for notifications for new videos. And if you have any stories that you want narrated on the channel, please send them to the above email. Enjoy. I've always had a fascination with abandoned buildings. Ever since I was old enough, I would gather my friends and we'd go on a trip to any neglected construction sites or haunted neighborhoods we could find. The adrenaline of being somewhere you don't belong just stuck with me. I would occasionally go exploring on my own, just for the extra rush. Loneliness just adds a powerful vibe. You could say I was an adrenaline junkie. Recently, I went on an exploration that made me rethink my adventures. It was a nice summer day in Chicago. I was visiting some friends who went to a community college there, and one of them had given me a tip on one of the abandoned buildings that I should check out. Of course, I was going to have a look. It would almost be crazy for me not to. It was already the afternoon, nearing nightfall. My friend mentioned that the place was an abandoned parking building that was underused and was inevitably closed off. I had packed myself some Lunchables, a flashlight, and some water. The second I arrived, I got immediate chills. Sure enough and fitting, the description, it was an abandoned parking building. I forgot to mention, I also brought a Polaroid camera. I know it sounds cliche, but I was a horror fanatic, and if I caught any paranormal incidents, I could use the physical pictures as proof. The place was fenced off, so I couldn't park my car inside the building. I snapped a picture of the outside of the building, then proceeded to climb the fence. I dropped to the floor on the other side, and immediately, a chill shot down my spine. I felt unusually nervous. I've never felt this worried on any of my previous ventures. I started on my way to the building. As expected, it was creepier up close. There were long vines that streamed down the sides of the building and hung off the various ledges. Tall grass surrounded the area, and small weeds sprung from small cracks in the cement of the bottom floor. Usually, you'd find graffiti or even broken glass bottles or anything in a place like this, but not here. The place looked as if it was built and then left alone and never tampered with. I assumed that it was simply because I was on the first floor. On that note, nothing resided in the area. It just looked like an empty parking lot. I decided to move up further, so I made my way to the second floor. Upon entering, I immediately noticed the change in architecture. There was a wall that divided the entrance of the floor from the other side of the room. In the middle of the wall where I was facing was a door. A door? Why was there a door? It wasn't even big enough for a small car to fit through. I chuckled at the idea that this was probably the reason the building was abandoned. I pulled out my camera and took a picture. The small piece of paper ejected from the camera. I shook it, then inspected the photo. Nothing out of the ordinary. I placed it in the pocket of my backpack and walked up to the door and opened it. The second I entered the room, a putrid smell filled my nose. The smell was so bad, in fact, that I had to place my hand over my mouth and nose to keep from hurling. When I looked into the room, I saw something in the middle of the floor. From where I was standing, it looked like some sort of dead animal. The flies that darted around the corpse only further indicated that possibility. I hesitantly approached the middle of the room, while covering the bottom half of my face with my shirt. Upon closer inspection, I realized that the thing was in fact a dead, mutilated pig. It had claw marks that streamed down to the lower half of its body, which was entirely missing. You could see the guts of the animal strung out of its body. I immediately received a sensation of utter horror. By this point, I had definitely seen enough. I turned around and made my way to the door. I placed my hand on the doorknob and was met with the realization that the door was locked. I sat there at the door for a good 3 minutes, frantically pulling the knob, to no avail. I stepped back and took a deep breath. Now calm, I began to consider my options. I pulled out my phone and was met with no bars. Despite this, I knew I could still call 911. However, no one picked up. The phone just kept ringing. I tried not to panic, as it wouldn't help anything. Even so, I was still shocked. I thought that maybe I could jump off the side of the ledge. I walked over to the half wall of the building and peered over. My eyes widened with fear. Some way and somehow, I was multiple stories higher than the second floor. Not just that, but the building seemed taller than before. I looked up to see the unbelievable. The building reached up above the clouds and so on. I couldn't believe my own eyes. I pulled out my camera to snap a shot of what I was seeing. The second I heard the click of the camera, a loud noise started going off behind the door to the room. I could see physical movements on the door that looked like pounding. I stumbled backwards, almost falling down. The door looked like it was almost giving in. I stood up and began to run to the ramp that led to the next floor. When I got to the ramp, I began to hear another noise. I turned my head to see that the pig that was once dead on the ground was now looking over at me, squealing mildly. It should be dead, but yet it was screaming Bloody Mary. I didn't give it another thought and continued up the ramp. Like before, this floor had a wall and then a door. I opened the door, and as I began to enter, I heard the door from the floor below me burst open, followed by heavy thumping footsteps rushing up the ramp. Adrenaline surged through my body as I quickly ran into the room and slammed the door behind me. I stumbled backwards and fell on my back. I sat up with my heart pounding, looking at the door. It took me a moment to realize that I no longer heard the footsteps and no longer heard the squealing pig. I waited a few seconds before laying back to catch my breath. I felt no inclination to inspect the room behind me, nor did I want to sit back up. I decided to close my eyes and rest for a bit. I don't remember how long it was before I fell asleep. I awoke to crickets and a warm breeze that tickled my cheeks. I sat up dazed and confused for a few moments before I jolted to a standing position. It took me a moment before my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I saw the blue hue of night. The moment felt beautiful, despite the previous events. I reached in my backpack and grabbed my flashlight. I noticed that my camera was already tucked into the backpack. When I flicked on the light, I realized that I was back on the first floor. Without even thinking, I rushed to the fence and practically threw myself over. I stumbled into my car and pulled out of the area and back on the main road. When I finally could catch my breath, I looked into the rearview mirror. My eyes caught the building for 3 seconds, just before it disappeared behind the tree line. It looked completely normal to me. It was no longer a skyscraper that reached through the clouds. I felt a moment of relief. When I got back to the hotel I was staying in, I threw my backpack on the bed and sat down beside it. I thought that maybe it was all a dream. Maybe I passed out due to the heat and had a nightmare. I opened my backpack to eat a Lunchable when I saw them. 3 Polaroid pictures. I pulled them out and flipped through them. The first one was the picture of the abandoned building that I took when I arrived. The second was the picture of the door that I saw when I reached the second floor, so it really did happen. When I got to the third photo, my eyes widened. In the photo I expected to see the building reaching into the skies, but instead, I saw myself standing next to some words on a wall that looked as if they were written in blood. The words read, "Never come back." I since burned the pictures and decided to forget the whole experience. I lost the will to ever explore abandoned buildings again. I'm writing this now to get it off my chest, and maybe even warn any people who plan to explore an abandoned building in the future. I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her. I would do anything for her, and that has never changed after all these years. We first met in college. We were both theater majors, and it was day one of Acting 1 class that our eyes met for the first time. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark brown curls. We stared at each other constantly the first day, and when we were partnered together, we knew that it was fate. "My name is Margaret," she said as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by her hand and kissed it. "Henry," I responded. She then took one of my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Sueno. We held each other's hand through the entire performance, and afterward, I walked her to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and got back together. Through it all, one thing never changed for me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went on to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and were always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true deep love that we felt for each other to the stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn. We had just finished a successful performance of the stage play, The Clean House, when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance," he said, a creepy English accent behind his words. "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for a very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret. "I'm very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two must truly love each other." "We do," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. "We love each other very much. I would do anything for her." I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. "That warms my heart to hear," he said, as he put his arms behind his back and looking up into the night sky. "True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you're not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try." He then looked at me, and I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever. He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. "Who are you?" I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. "Your biggest fan," he answered. He then walked away. Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch watching a movie, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Wonder who that could be," said Margaret as she got up to see who it was. She looked at the peephole and froze in place before taking a single step back and opening the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. "Honey," I said, standing up from the couch to join Margaret at the door. "Please, come in," Margaret said to the man, to my shock. "What are you doing?" I yelled, running to get to the door. The man stepped inside before I got there and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to them, I threw my fist and connected with his face, knocking him back outside. I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in some sort of a trance. I tried to snap her out of it. "Margaret!" I yelled, shaking her. "Margaret! Wake up!" There was nothing I could do to get her to respond. I shook her, slapped her, even splashed water in her face. Nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around until I saw a silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked and it was gone. I began to panic and ran to the gun safe in our bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we were very well trained in self-defense and firearms. We could each hold our own if our lives were in danger. And if there was ever a time to put that training to use, it was now. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man, holding Margaret by the face. "Let go of her," I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me, and the only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He then turned his head to Margaret, and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard, and I ran over. Margaret fell over too, but I caught her before she hit the ground. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over to the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood up quickly, readying my weapon once again. Suddenly, I felt a strong, tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was then thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaking as I raised my weapon once again. Again, he had a hold of Margaret, but this time, he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put her lips to his glowing red eyes staring right at me. "No!" I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me, as if inviting me to fire on him again. I obliged and fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. Not only did he have demon-like eyes, but his face was covered in disgusting, pulsating veins. In his mouth were 2 sharp fangs and a long slimy tongue, which rubbed against my face, as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to the arm that had a hold of me and fired twice. He growled in pain as he released me, and I connected the butt of my gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor, and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more, harder and faster. I could feel the blood gush and spray all over as the bones in his skull crack and collapse. By the time I was done, there was nothing but smashed bone, brains, and blood. I panted as I stood back up and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her, and she finally opened her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved that she was all right. I held her close, and we laid there until I looked over to where the body of the stranger should have been. He was gone, and panic arose once again, and we both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the process of regenerating his face. Before I had a chance to react, he sunk his fangs deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage, hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun. I felt bone crack again as he released her. Again, I mounted him and went to work, growing exhausted the longer it went. I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely regenerate again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He had put Margaret into a trance, merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. It wasn't until he invited himself inside that he actually got in. He had glowing red eyes and fangs, and he bit Margaret in the neck. He's a damn vampire, I thought to myself. While he was down, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed an old wooden brook. I broke it in half and ran back to the body where I rammed it as hard as I could, directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail its arms and legs all over. Suddenly, it stopped and went completely limp, before melting away into deep red blood and other disgusting fluids. After catching my breath, I slowly turned my attention to Margaret. She sat there in the darkness, legs folded and upper torso fully erect. "Honey," I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette, until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could think of to do. I love my wife. I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement, feeding her a pint of my own blood every day while I figure out what to do about her. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that cannot be communicated with. So, I fed her my blood, and she became herself again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It wasn't easy, but it was all we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far, until soon it wasn't enough. So I gave more and more, until the point that I was endangering myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs. Soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long, before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, as did I. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, which brings me to now. I'm sitting here, writing this, shaking even. There is literally blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused at first, because I loved her too much. "If you love me," she began, looking me deep in my eyes, her now pale blue eyes not blinking, "you will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you, Henry," she responded. I could hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake in her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventual silence. I broke down as her body melted away into liquid. I laid there in her remains, sobbing. I sit here now, with nothing left but the warning about the creatures of fiction that are very much a reality. I write my confession of the crimes I have committed out of love. I say goodbye to any friends or loved ones that may be reading this. I loved her, and I did everything for her. I have nightmares where I'm trapped in a shower. The drain is plugged, and the water won't stop pouring down on me. Water rises to my ankles, to my waist, and then over my head. The shower curtain turns to glass, and my screams turn to gargles. A dark figure presses its face against the glass on the other side, and it watches me. I plead, but it won't let me out. I swallow water and flail helplessly in my glass coffin. I wake up gagging. I know where the nightmare came from. I never have to dig deep. The incident is never far from my subconscious. Finding it is easy. Getting over it is not. It was the summer of my 12th birthday when the Hudsons moved in across the street. 3 people, one of them a really old woman. She was tiny, frail, skeletal almost. Thin white hair, faded blue flowery dress. Her head hung from her neck, and it wobbled as the man pushed her up a makeshift wheelchair ramp into the house. At the time, I couldn't figure out if she was dead or alive. A few minutes later, she appeared in an upstairs window, sitting in her wheelchair. She was directly facing my bedroom, and I cautiously peered out from behind my curtains. Her head was upright now, and she stared at me. Just stared, without moving her head an inch. I closed my drapes. For days, she sat at the window. She watched the cars putter down our suburban road and gazed at the neighborhood kids scurrying through their yards. I never saw anyone else in the room, never saw her move from the wheelchair. At night, I nervously peeked through the crack in my drapes. Her silhouette was still at the window, lights off, staring out into the darkness at my bedroom. I couldn't tell, but I knew that she was watching me. The stories about her cropped up pretty quick amongst my friends in the neighborhood, that she was a witch, that she was just a doll, that she was actually dead. But I knew she wasn't dead. Sure, I never saw her move from that window, not once, and I never saw her head turn, but I felt her eyes move as she studied me. I could feel her watching me, all alone in my room. In the middle of the night, with my drapes firmly shut, I'd wake up and shudder. Her eyes were on me. I just knew it. I began sleeping on the floor. The lower I was, the better. Maybe she couldn't see me if I was on the floor. I told my parents that the old woman across the street was creeping me out. I pleaded with them to talk to the Hudsons and ask them to move her to a room without a window. They laughed and told me to let her live out her twilight years in peace. She was just watching the street, they said, and that probably made her feel happy and feel younger. Are you just going to stick me in a windowless room when I'm an old lady? My mom laughed. Remind me to move in with your sister when I'm in a wheelchair. A week later, there was some commotion at the Hudsons. I watched from my bedroom window as the man ran out of the house and opened up the double doors of his van. He jogged inside, and he reappeared minutes later, pushing the old woman in her wheelchair down the ramp. She looked frailer than before. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her head was flung to the side, resting on her right shoulder. Her body jostled in the wheelchair. But her eyes never left me. She watched me the whole time. The man picked her up and placed her in the car. He folded the wheelchair and stuffed it in the trunk. He quickly hopped into the driver's seat. The younger woman pounced into the passenger seat, and the man put his foot to the pedal. The old woman's limp head still faced me. It bobbed up and down as the van reversed down the driveway. I studied her face. It was expressionless, emotionless. Her tongue slightly hung from the right side of her mouth, but her eyes were on mine, and they stayed on me. The van accelerated down the street, and it was gone. My parents heard the news that afternoon from the other neighbors. The old woman's condition was getting worse, and the Hudsons had taken her to some sort of a home. She wouldn't be coming back. I went straight to my bedroom, and I looked across the street. I smiled. Her window was finally empty. The Hudsons didn't come back the next day. No van. That night, I looked out towards the old woman's window. There was no one there. No wheelchair. But the bedroom light was on. I remember telling my dad I thought it was strange, and he just shrugged and said, "Must be on some sort of timer or something." I woke up in the middle of the night and nervously peered out my bedroom window. That bedroom light was still on. It suddenly flicked off, and I ducked below my window frame. I slowly rose and looked out, expecting to see the silhouette of that tiny, skeletal being. I watched for 10 minutes, pinching and straining my eyes. The lights quickly flickered on, and then off again. I slept on the floor again, clutching my pillow close. I had a late baseball practice the next evening. When I got home, my house was empty. My parents were at my little sister's softball game. I headed to the shower to rinse off. About 3 minutes into my shower, I felt cold. The hot steam was escaping the bathroom somehow, which didn't make sense because I had shut the door. I wiped the shampoo from my eyes, turned my head, and I heard a strange noise that would haunt me in my nightmares for years. The metal rings of the shower curtain being dragged across the shower rod. Someone was slowly opening the curtain. The shampoo stung my eyes, and through the stinging, I saw a dark figure behind the curtain. Long, pale, bony fingers gripped the curtain as it slowly opened. I instinctively backed up in the shower, and the curtain opened up completely. There stood the old woman. I must have only looked at her for 1, maybe 2 seconds, but at that moment, time stood still. All these years later, I can still draw you a vivid picture of the horrifying image in front of me. Disheveled white hair, crazy in her eyes, bones jutting out from under her stretched skin, stark naked. Blotched skin, warts all over her body, skinny breasts hanging to her waist, hair where I didn't know people could grow hair. She smiled grotesquely, and I felt the shower tile against my back and the hot water pound my face. In her other hand, the old woman held a letter opener. August, she mumbled. August, August, August. I leaped past her, knocking her tiny body to the floor. I ran downstairs naked and sopping wet. In my panic, I somehow remembered I was nude, and I yanked a pair of shorts out from the hamper in the laundry room, sending the hamper crashing to the floor. I hightailed it on foot down the street, eventually winding up at my friend's house. When the police arrived, they found the old woman, crumpled to a heap in the bathroom. The shower was still running. The policemen were all really nice to me, admiring me for my bravery. I told them what she said to me, August, and asked if they knew what she could have meant. It will be August in a few days, one of them shrugged. And you can never fully understand old and crazy, son. The Hudsons only came to our street once more to retrieve their stuff. The for sale sign was up in days. My mom told me they couldn't face their neighbors for what happened. Apparently, they had taken the old woman, the man's mother, to a special home downstate. Somehow, some way, the woman managed to escape the home and catch a bus back to our town. It never quite made sense to me. She was so old, so frail, and so helpless. She could barely move those weeks she lived in that house. How she had managed to travel hundreds of miles on her own. Anyway, you can imagine what this did to me. I didn't take a shower for 21 years. I took baths, which I suppose aren't that different. It's still a tub, and it involves hot and soapy water. But a shower with its closed curtain, water peppering the tub floor, and steam climbing the walls. You get lost inside your own head in the shower. Thoughts consume you, and it feels so utterly safe. For a few minutes, you are alone from the world. It's your own private, misty kingdom. But that's what makes the shower dangerous. You're enclosed, vulnerable, and naked. You're exposed. I talked to people about it. My parents, a shrink. But mainly, I tried to push the incident deep down into places where I couldn't find it. I didn't talk about it with anyone since I was a kid. Life carried on. Besides the baths, I was pretty normal. A few months ago, something inside me clicked. I felt the urge to re-examine the incident. It was almost like a voice in my head was telling me to do it. My head wanted closure. I spent hours online one night, trying to track down any information on the Hudsons and the old woman. I finally found out what I was looking for, an obituary for the old woman. She had died 4 years ago. Somehow, that walking skeleton hadn't checked out for another 15 years. The obituary photo was a black and white picture from when she was a young woman. It was a photo of her and her deceased husband on their wedding day. His name was August, and he looked exactly like me. I closed the browser and stared at my computer desktop for 10 minutes. It finally made more sense. Why she called me August. Why she was obsessed with watching me. Maybe she used to write letters to her husband, and that's why she was clutching the letter opener that night. For a small moment, I felt a little better. Things always feel better when they make more sense. Honey, is everything okay? It was my wife. I think so, I said. I took the first shower I had taken in years that night. I didn't even jump when the curtain rungs dragged across the shower rod and my wife entered. But as she embraced me under the hot water, one question wouldn't leave my head. How come the young woman in that wedding picture looks exactly like my wife? They never stop laughing. When I was a kid, I was on this show called Jerry's Place. The show has basically been erased from the public consciousness, so don't rack your brain if you can't remember it. We were working for a small Canadian studio, hoping to market the show to an American audience, but half of season 1 never even aired. The show followed a fairly typical formula. There was a father and a mother character, wise yet silly parents who dispensed advice and hugs in equal parts, an older teenage sibling who was aloof and angsty, but also brought friends over to add color to a small cast, and 2 younger siblings, one of them very young, and the other of around 9 or 10, who are there to make hijinks and generally move the story along. The latter was my niche. I was the middle child, and I was usually responsible for comic relief, or having some part in the problem of the week's story. The 2 adult characters were Linda and Mike, and they were actually pretty cool too. Mike was a lifelong actor that always had a word of advice, or a smile if you were feeling scared. As someone who grew up without a father, Mike was the person I used as a model for what a man should be, though it's probably become intertwined with his character on the show to a certain degree. Linda was great too. A mom with kids of her own who was always looking after us when we weren't shooting on set and making sure that we got enough to eat. My own mother was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on at home, so there were evenings when I would join Linda and her family for dinner until my mom could pick me up. Linda and Mike were almost like surrogate parents for me during that year of my life, and Rachel and Mark became almost like adopted siblings. Rachel was the older sister, angsty and above it all on camera, but she was always very nice off screen. Rachel would run lines with me when I was scared and always helped me when I needed something. She was actually 19, though she played a 16-year-old, and on the nights when Linda couldn't take me, I would hang out with Rachel until Mom came to pick me up. Mark, the younger brother, was 6, and we weren't too far off in age. Not really. We had similar interests. We would sit around between scenes and talk about Ninja Turtles, or the Power Rangers, or play Game Boy together. In many ways, those 5 people became family to me for that year and a half of my life. It makes the rest of this story all the harder to tell. It was a typical day of shooting. We had finished what would have been season 1, and were shooting some scenes from season 2. The network had been pleased with our viewership so far, so a second season seemed to be in the cards. With the second season, though, came a live studio audience. This was the 90s, and live studio audiences were all the rage. The first season had been live a few times, for special episodes, but this season would have had a live audience throughout. The presence of an audience was a bit distracting, and often led to Mark and I playing it up a little to get their attention. We had been asked to ignore them, but we were young, and the laughter of adults meant a lot to us. We were on episode 6 of season 2 when they brought in a very different audience. I remember it perfectly. The event gouged into my mind surgically. We were setting up for the opening scene when the stage door opened, and a crowd of people filled in. There were about 20 of them. Our audiences tended to be slow, and I can remember not seeing any children or strollers as they filled into the dark rows of seats. Usually, they brought the house lights up for this, allowing us to see the audience. But today, the crowd sat in shadow. Mark whispered to me about it, saying they looked a little creepy, all huddled up in the corner like that. But I told him it was probably just something new the director was doing to make us ignore them. We set up for the shot, and I felt myself looking out to the crowd out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't that dark out there, not really. But the whole audience sat in a small sea of darkness that seemed to crowd around them. They didn't talk. They didn't shuffle. They just hunched there and waited for us to begin. We rolled the opening. Jerry's Place is filmed before a live studio audience, and began. As Mike came on stage, the titular Jerry, I'd expected the crowd to clap as they usually did when a character came on scene. They didn't, though. They just sat there and waited. The director looked back at them, but shrugged and whispered something to his assistant. Mike looked out at the audience strangely, too, but he was a pro and didn't let it mess him up. Linda and Rachel, Megan and Bonnie on the show were watching TV as Mike walked in from the kitchen and delivered his lines. They cued Mark and I to run downstairs and begin the show's problem, a broken toy that was important to me. By the end of the show, Mark would have saved enough money to buy me a new one, and I would learn a lesson about sharing, and everyone at home would feel warm and fuzzy as my brother and I hugged it out. At least that's how it should have gone. I came downstairs yelling about my toy, a model airplane, and Mark was right behind me in typical little brother fashion. Mike looked at the plane and asked if I couldn't just use it like this. I hit my mark and prepared to deliver my character's catchphrase. Catchphrases were prominent in the 90s. They were also very marketable, and my catchphrase was supposed to elicit laughter from the audience. Until then, they had just been sitting there, quietly. I wish they had stayed quiet. Play with a broken toy? That's going to be a deal breaker for me, Pops, I said, looking at the audience as I did so. That's when they started to laugh. I was expecting a chuckle, maybe even a full-fledged laugh or two, but the audience emitted that hearty, canned laughter that you hear on sitcoms when a real audience might be too much. Mike started to give his next line, but the audience just kept laughing. I looked at them, my face still holding that mischievous smile that it always did after my catchphrase, and saw that the shadowy crowd was laughing and heaving in unison. The shadowy mod was hitching and chuckling as one, and as I watched, I felt my smile faltering. Mike tried to give his next line again, but the laughter overtopped him. The director said something to his assistant, and the man brought out cardboard cards that read, "Quiet, please." He held them high, right in front of the audience, but the audience just kept laughing. Their laughter had begun to sound sick. The longer they laughed, the more painful and crazed it began to sound. Someone in the crowd was clearly choking, but they continued to laugh through it. The laughter never rose or fell in volume, just the mad, canned laughter I would become so familiar with later in life. It was emotionless and inhuman, and it just continued to pour out of them as they sat huddled in the shadows. The assistant shouted at the crowd then, the director calling for the cameras to be cut. One of the cameramen, I can't remember his name, but he was always kind of a joker, turned his camera to film the crowd. Maybe he thought it would be great for a gag reel or something like that. Perhaps he thought the studio was playing a joke on us. But whatever he was thinking, he had an excellent seat for what happened next. When the assistant's shouts failed to gain their attention, he walked into the seats and started yelling at the crowd. That was when his angry shouts turned into underwhelmed laughs, and he, too, started chuckling. The director turned and started shouting at the crowd to be quiet, even as he shouted at his assistant to come down. By this point, we had all started milling about close to our marks, so we could start again. I couldn't help but notice Rachel and Linda on the couch, and how Linda had a protective arm around Rachel. They looked scared, and despite being trained to stay close to our marks, I went over and sat with them, wanting to be in that protective bubble. A stagehand had gone into the audience to get the assistant back, but now he was sitting and chuckling right along with the rest. It was that same canned laughter, but it sounded like lunatics now. They were consistent, unchanging in pitch or fervor, and it was all becoming too spooky for me. Mark came to sit beside me as well, and I wrapped a brotherly arm around him, just as Linda had Rachel. "I don't like this," Mark cried as big tears rolled down his cheeks. "They're scaring me." I told him that I was pretty scared too, and when Mike came up to put his hands on the back of the couch, I felt safe knowing he was there. As we sat, another stagehand went up. He grasped the first by the arm, pulling at him and trying to get him to leave. But soon he too was laughing and grinning as he took a seat next to him. The director forbade anyone else to go up after that. The crew sat huddled together on the edge of the set as they tried to figure out what this was. There seemed to be a barrier between them and us. None of them came into our little circle of protection on the couch, and none of us felt the need to go to them. The director sent a stagehand to get security after the third member of the crew joined them. The stagehand found the doors to be locked, and none of his keys would open them. He came back white-faced, skirting the audience seats as though whatever they had might be airborne. The director sent someone to see if the roof access was open, but they discovered the same thing. The keys didn't work, and the hatch was locked. Someone tried a landline in the back, but found no dial tone. This was before cell phones had become the norm, but the director had a bag phone that he tried. Same thing. No dial tone, and no calls would go out either. And all the while, they laughed. After an hour, they were still laughing. The director and some of the crew had broken the distance and came to sit around our couch. They had brought items from the food service table over, and we all just kind of had a picnic. It would have been nice had the creepy laughing shadow people not been staring at us the whole time. As we ate, I noticed that some of the crew had stayed away and seemed to be eating on the set's outskirts. They kept looking at the crowd. Some of them were staring, and when I asked the director about them, he shook his head. One of them claims that his father is sitting in the audience. "What?" Mike asked, his mouth full of a sandwich. "He says that the man in the front row near the middle is his father. He says it can't be him because he died of lung cancer last year, but that it definitely looks like him. He says that every now and again, the laughing man will look at him and try to wave him over. He knows he shouldn't go, but he says that every time the guy waves him over, it's hard to not go." "That's nuts," Linda breathes. "Each of them has a story like that," the director said. "For Carrie, he pointed to the redhead with a ponytail. It's her girlfriend who left for New Mexico and never came back. For Steve, he pointed to a man with a salt and pepper crew cut. It's his sister who stopped talking to him after his parents left him everything in their will. They all have someone, and all of them think they might." But as he spoke, we saw Carrie get up and take a step towards the chuckling crowd. One of the others grabbed at her, but she shrugged them off and walked towards the crowd like someone in a dream. She embraced one of the shadow masses, and then sat next to them, chuckling and smiling as his butt pressed the seat. After Steve left too, the director decided to take action. He told one of the hands near us to turn up the house light. He wanted lights on the crowd so we could see who they were. Maybe they would stop laughing if their cover was blown, and this could all be over, and we could all get back to work. He still seemed to think that this might be a prank, though not a very funny one, and wanted an end to it already. Some of the stagehands went to get things set up, but we all kept looking at that quietly chuckling behemoth. Mark had fallen asleep somehow, and I kept my arm wrapped around him as though I might stand between him and the tide should they charge. I was still munching at the fruit from the food table, and I didn't notice Rachel getting up until my bowl of honeydew almost tipped over. Linda grabbed her wrist, anchoring her to the couch. But when I looked up, I could see that her eyes were big and starry. Her blonde ponytail bobbed a little as she scanned the crowd, and Linda started asking her what she was looking for. I thought I saw someone up there, someone I haven't seen in a very long time. But she gasped harshly then. It's him. Oh my God. It's him. She was pulling against Linda's hand, but Linda refused to let go. Who, Rachel? Who is it? Linda asked, trying to restrain the girl as Mike moved to help. It's my dad. My dad's up there. He looks just like he did in the photo my mom has in her dresser drawer. He hasn't changed a bit. I looked at the crowd, trying to see who she was looking at, but failing. Rachel, your dad died before you were born. Your mother told me about his incident. It can't be him. But it is, Rachel almost screamed, pitching her body from side to side as she tried to break free. Mike and Linda held her tightly, and I scooted closer to Mark so Mike could sit on the couch. The two of them sat there and held her as she sobbed for them to let her go. She used a lot of swear words as she thrashed about, but they refused to let her go. When she finally stopped, she sat crying into Linda's shoulder as the two of them hugged her tightly. Someone yelled down from the catwalk then, and the stage was suddenly awash with light. The overheads were unbearably bright, and as they all lit at once, I remember tinting my eyes with my hand, so they didn't blind me. We had used them for beach scenes a few times when rain caused us to not shoot on location, and I can remember thinking that they were so much brighter than the real sun. They lit up every corner of the set, but as I squinted at the seats, I realized I'd been wrong. Every corner but that one, it seemed. The seats were still a pool of shadows, but when the light hit them, everything changed. The low chuckling became a strange hybrid of screaming and deep booming laughter. The kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum. The kind of laughter you heard in hell. The people in the seats never moved, but the darkness did. It plumed out like a fog and started rolling towards us. Those sitting near the seats were hit, and we could hear their laughter starting as they fell to their knees and clutched their stomachs. The director shouted at the crew to kill the lights, but it was much too late. The darkness was angry now, and it was no longer satisfied with the few people it had in the seats. It was coming for us. Mike grabbed Mark and me, lifted us up in his strong arms, and started running backstage. He turned to yell for Linda, but she was fighting with Rachel as the girl tried to free herself again. She was straining towards the fog, and it was creeping in to get both of them. Mike yelled for her to let Rachel go if she wouldn't come, but Linda refused to leave her there. She strained and pulled at the girl, but Rachel was apparently stronger than she looked. It didn't matter a moment later as the fog rolled in, and they were both little more than chuckling shadows. Mike ran to the back, Mark crying and asking him what was going on. He had woke up when Mike picked him up, and Mike was looking frantically for some way to escape. He saw a window and lifted a piece of wood to smash it against. As he brought the wood down, however, he might as well have been hitting concrete, because the board bounced off, splinters flying. The dark fog was rolling past the set wall now, and Mike was almost out of options. Mark and I just stood against the wall, eyes roving around like scared dogs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, Mike settled on a closet. It was full of brooms and mops, but we didn't have time to move them by that point. Mike pushed us in and sighed as he saw how much room we took up. As the fog plumed behind him, he slammed the door and left us in total darkness. His laughter started a few seconds later, and the sound nearly drove us mad as we huddled in the tiny closet. Mark and I hunched, arms wrapped around each other, expecting that we would both begin to laugh at any minute. We sat like that for a long time. I have no idea how long until we both must have fallen asleep to the sound of Mike's choking laughter. When I woke up, I was in a hospital, and my mother was asleep in the chair next to my bed. I got the whole story a few days later. My mother didn't know much, She had come to the set only to find all the doors locked and police trying to get in. Once they had gotten in, some of them started laughing and couldn't stop. The paramedics and the fire department had come. After searching the place with breathing equipment, they found Mark and I and brought us to safety. There was nothing wrong with either of us, not physically, but the two of us had been catatonic for nearly 3 days. The man from the studio, the one in the pristine suit and the oiled hair, had told me a different story. He said there had been some kind of a gas leak and claimed that most of those present had been hallucinating due to gas. The audience, cast, and crew had all died due to gas inhalation, and Mark and I had been lucky to survive. Our parents would both sign non-disclosure agreements. We would promise not to talk about anything we had seen, and in exchange for a large amount of financial compensation. My mother and I needed the money now that the show was going to be canceled. Both our parents signed, and Mark and I went our separate ways. The whole event was deemed a tragic incident, and I never worked in showbiz again. That would be the end of this story, if it weren't for the email I received a week ago. I'm in my 30s now, and about a week ago, I got a Facebook request from Mark. I had expected that he wanted to catch up, have a beer, and share some old stories, but his first message was far from what I had expected. He sent me a messenger request a few seconds later, and after accepting, he sent me 7 words. Are they still laughing for you too? We met up for that beer the next day. Mark was older, but far from doing well. The guy looked rough, borderline homeless, and seemed eternally looking around to see who was near him. He asked if I still heard the laughter. I told him I hadn't, not since that day all those years ago. He said that for him, it had never stopped. He would wake up to see shadowy figures at the end of his bed, that canned laughter bubbling from their dark lips. He said Rachel and Linda and Mike were right out front too, white teeth smiling as they laughed and laughed. His parents hadn't believed him. They thought it was just bad dreams because of the incident. The drugs the shrinks gave him just meant he was a drooling zombie, as the laughing apparitions chuckled on and on. He started using young. It was alcohol at first. His dad had a cabinet in the living room. Then drugs when he was in high school. He stole prescription drugs, used blends of different drugs, drank himself into oblivion, but nothing helped. Every night they were there, waiting for him, and every night he screamed until they disappeared with the light of day or the arrival of someone else. Just wanted to see if you'd found a way to make them stop too, big brother, he said sadly as he left the bar. He killed himself a week later. He put a gun in his mouth, and the rest is pretty easy to figure out. I envy him now. I envy that he had the strength to do what needed to be done. About a week ago, I woke up to the sound of that canned laughter that always creeped me out in sitcoms. I fumbled for the remote, thinking I'd just left the TV on. But as the TV came to life, I saw them. They were arrayed at the foot of my bed. Their bodies made of living darkness, made all the murkier by the light of the TV, and their laughter went on and on. Mark was amongst them, his unkempt hair now a raven mane of living darkness. Mike was there too, and Linda, and Rachel. All of them laughing and laughing as I lay in bed, frozen in terror. They left with the sun, and I got up to write this. I don't know how long I can take this. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to see them, but I'm too afraid to take Mark's way out either. I see him amongst them, laughing and laughing like an audience in hell, and I wonder if I will join them too in the end. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to be awake, afraid to see their faces, and afraid of running into them again. My eyes are getting heavy. The 4th cup of coffee is jittering in my hand. I wonder if it hurts to laugh forever. Perhaps I'll find out soon. Nobody believes the boy with the overactive imagination. Nobody believes the man who will forever shoulder the lamentable stigma of having once been institutionalized. I was the former once, but will regrettably always be the latter now. Nobody ever believed me. I've been told I have episodes, that I don't always know what's real, that I'm delusional and paranoid, that I, and I alone, killed my brother. But I know the truth. I didn't kill my brother. It was the riverbank boy. He has stalked me ever since, determined to finish the job. Drowning one brother isn't enough for him. He isn't going to rest until he has condemned both brothers to a watery grave. I was a skittish and nervous child growing up. The dark terrified me, as is to be expected at a young age. But I was also terrified of getting in the water. While other kids were taking swimming lessons, I was one of the cowardly few who sat out. I had, and still have, a mortal fear of the water. So it was a particularly cruel stunt by my older brother Derek to tell me about the riverbank boy just a day before my first family camping trip. I was only 6 years old then, and my parents hoped that the beautiful natural scenery of flowing water would help assuage my fear, that it would be such a gorgeous visual feast that I'd forget my fears and revel in all of nature, water included. But any faint hopes my parents had were completely subverted by my brother's humor at my expense. "Watch out for the riverbank boy while you're out in those woods, James," he had said. I asked him what that was. "Oh, he's a young boy, probably just a couple years older than you. Years ago, he drowned in the river. He spends his time in the river and on the bank. Maybe if you're lucky, he'll be busy. He might be eating a fish, or relaxing, or maybe even skipping rocks. If so, don't disturb him. If you do, his face will take on a look of rage. He'll chase you down, drag you into the river, and drown you." I was freaking out by now, but Derek wasn't finished. "Or maybe you'll see him bathing in the river, in which case he will invite you in. Don't get in with him. He'll drown you. But maybe, just maybe, you won't see him at all. In that case, he's below the water, waiting to drag you to a watery grave. Almost like a crocodile in those nature shows you watch. Be careful, James. Stay away from the water, or the riverbank boy will get you." He lunged forward and grabbed my arm to emphasize the fright of that last part, and I screamed, and he laughed. I refused to take a bath that night. I was afraid that the riverbank boy would drown me in the tub. My fertile, hyperactive imagination was compounded with my fear of the water for exactly the kind of result you'd expect. I would vehemently refuse to get in the water, to my parents' exasperation and my brother's taunts. I sat on the bank, always several feet from the water, when my parents and brother engaged in water-based activities. But a week went by and I saw no sign of the riverbank boy. I was starting to think it had all been a joke by some asinine brother. On the last day of the trip, I resolved to conquer my phobia. My brother and I went to the river, slightly ahead of our parents, who said they'd join us in a few minutes. Irresponsible, I know. I often wonder if they could have stopped it had they been there. But there's no use speculating. It only augments the sadness and amplifies the tragedy that transpired. My brother suddenly decided to race me to the water. He was 2 years older, taller, and faster, and consequently dusted my ass. He sped around the trees down to the river over my protestations to wait up. Several seconds later, panting for breath and my sides on fire, I rounded the corner. There was nobody there. Had the riverbank boy gotten him? "Derek!" I called out quietly. I took a few cautious steps towards the river. I went to call out Derek's name again when I was interrupted by a shove from behind. Fear gripped every ounce of my being as I fell into the water. It was shallow, probably less than 2 feet, but that was more than enough to go under. I surfaced, coughing and sputtering for breath, terrified that I had been attacked by the riverbank boy. I saw a boy, just a couple of years older than me, just as Derek had said the riverbank boy was. I couldn't clearly make out the rest of his features, as my eyes were stung and my vision blurred by the water. My heart pounded in my chest. Fight or flight kicked in. I couldn't exactly flee further into the river, so I was left with one option: fight. I lunged forward, grabbing the riverbank boy's leg. He cried out in surprise and toppled into the water. He clearly hadn't been expecting me to fight back. I was on him before he could get back up. He was bigger than me, and probably stronger, but I had the advantageous position. Additionally, my strength was undoubtedly greatly improved for the time being as a result of my fight or flight experience. I got on top of him and held his head under the water. He cried desperately now. I was beating him at his own game, and he was terrified. One of his hands frantically thrashed above the surface, and a steady stream of bubbles rose to the surface. Until they didn't, I held him under the water until the hand went still, until the bubbles stopped. And even then I didn't back off. I was going to beat the riverbank boy, and I thought I had. A horrified, desperate shout snapped me out of the moment I was absorbed into. Time, previously at a standstill for me, now flowed freely again. "James!" came my mother's hysteric shout as a pair of large hands, my dad's hands, wrenched me off the riverbank boy. I tried to say it was okay, that I was all right and had won, but my parents continued to shout in hysterics as they pulled Derek's lifeless body from the water. The riverbank boy was nowhere to be seen. It was horrible after that day. I tried to explain what had happened, that the riverbank boy had gotten Derek, and that I had been winning the fight when I was apparently pulled off before I could finish the job. I know I didn't finish the job. How else could he have been gone? How else could he still be stalking me? I was taken to a doctor not long after. I tried to explain, but nobody believed me. I was wrongfully diagnosed as disturbed. It was determined that I had a break from reality. They had the temerity to say I drowned Derek, that we had been horseplaying in the water, and that tragic results had ensued when it got carried away, when I got carried away. Things were a blur for a while after that. The trips to the doctor, the medications, the mixture of pained and angry looks my mere presence elicited. Nobody would have any of it. Nobody believed me that the riverbank boy was real, and that it was he who had drowned Derek. As if the disbelief and cold treatment I received wasn't bad enough, the riverbank boy was back. He was, and still is, hell-bent on finishing what he started. He was outside my window every night whenever it rained. I nearly shit myself the first time I saw him, and realized that he was back. My parents were having none of it. They insisted that it was just my reflection and nothing more. But I knew what was really happening. That monster followed me to summer camp too, always lurking in the pool. He grabbed me and dragged me in one time. But again, nobody believed me. Nobody listened. The lifeguard and camp counselor said that Nate Hendricks, the camp's resident bully, had pulled me in. But I know it was the riverbank boy. He wanted to drag me to my death into the chlorinated depths of the pool. No lies, no amount of gaslighting could fool me. I refused to go back to camp after that. It was too dangerous. It was downhill from there. I refused to shower or bathe. It was too dangerous. On one harrowing night, I heard him hopping around in the bathroom. He had never gotten inside before. I screamed, and screamed, and screamed. If it were a movie, I probably would have shattered the light bulb with my piercing scream. This wasn't a movie. All I got was the last straw from my parents. They said that it had just been the faucet dripping. Why are they so fervent in the maintenance of their bald-faced lies? But despite my continued insistence of the truth, that was the last straw. At 13 years of age, I was institutionalized. I didn't see the riverbank boy for the 5 years I spent in that facility, but I knew he was waiting, biding his time until I got out. I got out 2 years ago. I missed the safety of the hospital walls. He couldn't get me in there. But now I see him again. Nobody takes me seriously. Same as always. Nobody took me seriously inside the hospital either. but at least I was safe. I refuse to shower or bathe again, and have not done so in months. I avoid all windows religiously when it rains. He's invariably waiting every time. He is always in the corner of my eye, watching, waiting for an opportunity to drown me, just like he drowned Derek years ago. People still refuse to accept the truth. They still say that I drowned Derek, but the riverbank boy killed my brother. I swear it wasn't me. While I'm not at liberty to say which state has done so, I can tell you that around a year ago, I picked up a job removing those corpses you see at the side of the road. Some are spotted quickly, and the cleanup is as easy as picking up the carcass and chucking it in. Sometimes the roadkill is left for days, or hit by several cars. These cases are a pain in the ass. A lot goes into making sure your kids don't break out crying on your 5-hour road trip when they see Bambi at the side of the road. The work is quiet. People don't bother you, and other than an intercom on my dashboard telling me where to go, I have little reason to talk to anyone. I just traverse the highways in my truck that looks eerily similar to what horror movies would have you expect someone in my profession to be driving. In life, you go through changes. Not all of them are welcome, but they're going to happen whether you're ready or not. Just gotta roll with the punches. That's what I'm doing. Scraping remains off 4 lanes isn't enough to pay the bills though, and it was around the time I was close to losing my home that a peculiar phone call gave me an interesting change. I can't remember the date, but 3 months ago I was approached with an offer that, at first, was nothing but humorous. They told me the line of work I was already in would seamlessly integrate into the work they had lined up for me. They were right. I was used to long rides, solitude, and most importantly, I knew how to dispose of an animal. With cautious hesitation, I agreed, and not a day passed by before I received my first call. The encounter nearly made me quit on the spot, until I saw the pay. I could afford a nice shiny pickup truck, but I can't imagine the use of owning something like that and spraying the thing down every night. Besides, old Elvis has been keeping me company ever since I pulled my first animal remains off the black tar. Even more so, ever since my first night with that thing, I wised up and began to teach Elvis some new tricks. The truck ain't pretty on the outside, but it could outrace 80% of the cars I'd seen passing me by. There's no need for me to elaborate much on my time back then. I don't think either of my employers would be too keen on recounting all that. Nor will they like what I'm doing now, but for the sake of compilation. I'm writing my jobs down from now on. You see, from 9 to 5, I do nothing but wait until some poor animal's day is up, until time or nature kills it. Once that shift ends, though, I sit by my radio and wait. Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, until I hear faint static kick in and give me the location, situation, and the cryptid I'd be hunting that evening. You've no doubt heard stories of some of the cryptids you can come across. Some are even famous. For every cryptid you've heard of, there's 10 more waiting in the bushes. Those are the ones that I'm called to take care of. Not all of them are out to harm humans, and some can exist peacefully with the surrounding ecosystems. But when one goes rogue or harms their biome, that's when I'm called in. Tonight I was called in to take care of a swift bastard called the Mild Wolf. They all have cute nicknames like that. The Mild Wolf was once thought to be in a rare category of cryptids that were singular in nature, meaning it was only one of its kind. It wasn't until 2 attacks were sighted 10 miles apart in the time frame of 5 minutes. These things are fast, but not that fast. Thank God. They're agile and cunning, so when one is spotted, it becomes a priority. They attack humans for food, and seemingly for sport, and also feed on any species of wolf that happens to habitate the area. The attacks resemble that of a pack of wolves, with how vicious the claw and bite marks can be. So after receiving the call, I made my way to the cold storage where I kept any clean roadkill and pulled the deer from the freezer. Heavy bastard. I located the sighting on a map, some backwoods, or a car path that was primarily used by lost foreigners. It had one way in and out, making it a perfect road to plot a trap on. So that's what I did. Then after gathering the necessary supplies, I chucked everything into the truck bed and took off. By the time I finally hit the road, the sun had long since left the sky and it was approaching midnight. This is typically the best time for hunts. The fewer people, the better. But if you wait too long, you risk the thing hauling up for the night. Mile wolves are very adept at making themselves invisible and can even trick passing observers into thinking they're just witnessing a normal wolf. The mile wolf gets its name from its body structure. If you were looking at it head on, all you would see is a very tall wolf. Its legs are thin and stretched, giving a malnourished appearance. Their height could dwarf the extinct dire wolves. I've heard of mile wolves that have reached up to 6 feet in height. I'm thankful I've never seen one of those. The community is still split on whether or not mile wolves have a hierarchy like regular packs do. If they do, though, that 6-footer was no doubt the alpha. Their tall stature isn't their main feature. No, it gets weirder. The mile wolf will rarely be seen from the side, but if you were to catch a glimpse, you would see a long, cylindrical-like stomach and chest. They've been compared to snakes and worms, but I see a stronger resemblance to ferrets. They can reach over 10 feet in length, and you can tell they're hungry and the middle of their tube-like body is sagging. If that's something you manage to see, it's already too late for you. As I've said before, these suckers are fast. It doesn't matter if they're running away or towards you. They are faster. Their bodies allow them to slink through the forest as if they were made of water. If you wanted to kill one, you'd have to do so swiftly, but even that wouldn't be easy. For whatever reason, all these cryptids have accelerated healing, and the mile wolf is among the worst of them. Like the worms they resemble, a limb or even half of its body will begin to regrow after being severed. There is one thing that can halt the healing completely, and it's far too cliché for my taste, but it's got the job done. Going over the plan in my head, I pulled up to my destination, about halfway through the secluded trail, and turned the truck off. I withdrew several small speakers from the back of the truck and placed them at the random positions on the road. On the side of the road, I placed a uniform row of rusty iron and covered them with leaves. Mile wolves will not make a sound as they approach you. If you are hunting one, you must act fast and quiet, or the tables will turn before you even realize you're drawing your last breath. Their teeth are some of the sharpest I've ever seen. They would slice through a tree faster than a chainsaw if one had the mind to do so. Reaching into my truck, I pulled the double-barrel shotgun I bought my first day on this job. It and Elvis got together well. Then my hands found the revolver and dropped a single, very expensive bullet into the chamber. I placed them both on the road, laying them gently next to a ghillie suit. Then the final piece was dragged from the truck bed. Several space heaters were focused on the deer. The stench it gave off was horrendous, but it was powerful, and I didn't have time to pay it mind. I placed it in the road, a safe distance from the speakers, iron, and my own supplies. With a hunting knife, I stuck the deer's stomach and pulled, the fine skin giving way easily. I felt a flow of red run past my hands. Quickly, I rushed to the open door of my truck and took one last heavy breath, just to center myself. My hand pressed hard on the car's steering wheel, and the horn cried loud into the vast silence of the night, bouncing through the trees. Slamming the door, I swiftly made my way to the ghillie suit, and threw myself under it. I lay on the road, watching the deer's body lying in the road. Moonlight as my only source of light, I could see it reflecting off the pool now surrounding the deer. Mile wolves are cautious. I had no doubt that it was sizing up the deer. I had no doubt it wanted the easy prey. Before I knew it, a shadow lunged onto the lifeless deer carcass. Ugly sounds of gnawing, like ripping sheets of paper, could be heard coming from the mass of meat. My fingers wrapped around the grip of my shotgun. There was going to be no opening. I was just going to have to go for it and hope everything worked out. You have to take leaps of faith like that a lot in my line of work. Going over the plan one more time in my head, I readied and calmed myself. It was time. Like a maniac, I sprung from under the ghillie suit and readied my shotgun. Before I even raised the barrel, it was already aware of me. Its long, slender body began contorting to face me. I didn't have the time, so without a clear shot, I pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred me for a minute, but I could see I did some damage to its legs. The Mile Wolf swung away from me after being shot. It was attempting to flee. It made it several feet, and a large hum emitted from one of the speakers, frightening the Mile Wolf. As it picked a new direction, another speaker went off. It made a frantic sprint towards my truck. My finger clicked a small rubber button on my keys, and the lights of the truck shined bright, piercing through the darkness. The road lit up. I could now see the Mile Wolf's albino white hair that was standing on end, like it was a pissed-off cat. Along with the lights, the radio and the speakers mounted atop good old Elvis chimed a wonderful tune of harsh static. The Mile Wolf retched and ran towards the side of the road. The biggest part of this job is having foresight. You are hunting the things that go bump in the night. Most of them are still animals, though, and their actions can be predicted. As I watched the Mile Wolf clamber to the side of the road, and as I heard the harsh clamping of the row of bear traps, I knew I was chalking up another successful hunt. The thing's frantic movements had been its undoing. If just one or two of its legs had been caught, it could have gnawed them off and I'd have no chance of catching up. But it had slipped, and the traps closed in on its stomach and neared just below its neck. As I walked over, I pulled out the revolver. If left be, this thing would recover and be angrier than ever. It looked up at me and flashed bright green eyes, giving off several cries for mercy. But the Mile Wolf is crafty. If you show it mercy, it will not return the favor. I had more than enough time. I aimed up the perfect shot, and with the pull of the trigger, the hammer brought down and ejected the bullet. A gleaming oval of silver flew from the barrel and straight into the Mile Wolf's head. The only way to really kill one of these is to stop the regeneration completely. Silver is the cheapest compound known to do such a thing. Still, it ain't cheap. The rest is no different from my morning job, just a little more intimate. I removed the traps and threw the corpse into the back of my truck, covering it with the ghillie suit. And after packing up all my supplies, I hopped in and began the long drive home. I am tired, but I am alive, and there is a very long wolf hanging in cold storage. I keep the cryptid bodies around for a while too, before burying them, because just like the roadkill, they have their purpose to serve too. While I'm not at liberty to say which state has done so, I can tell you that around a year ago, I picked up a job removing those corpses you see at the side of the road. Some are spotted quickly, and the cleanup is as easy as picking up the carcass and chucking it in. Sometimes the roadkill is left for days, or hit by several cars. These cases are a pain in the ass. A lot goes into making sure your kids don't break out crying on your 5-hour road trip when they see Bambi at the side of the road. The work is quiet. People don't bother you, and other than an intercom on my dashboard telling me where to go, I have little reason to talk to anyone. I just traverse the highways in my truck that looks eerily similar to what horror movies would have you expect someone in my profession to be driving. In life, you go through changes. Not all of them are welcome, but they're going to happen whether you're ready or not. Just gotta roll with the punches. That's what I'm doing. Scraping remains off 4 lanes isn't enough to pay the bills though, and it was around the time I was close to losing my home that a peculiar phone call gave me an interesting change. I can't remember the date, but 3 months ago I was approached with an offer that, at first, was nothing but humorous. They told me the line of work I was already in would seamlessly integrate into the work they had lined up for me. They were right. I was used to long rides, solitude, and most importantly, I knew how to dispose of an animal. With cautious hesitation, I agreed, and not a day passed by before I received my first call. The encounter nearly made me quit on the spot, until I saw the pay. I could afford a nice shiny pickup truck, but I can't imagine the use of owning something like that and spraying the thing down every night. Besides, Old Elvis has been keeping me company ever since I pulled my first animal remains off the black tar. Even more so, ever since my first night with that thing, I wised up and began to teach Elvis some new tricks. The truck ain't pretty on the outside, but it could outrace 80% of the cars I'd seen passing me by. There's no need for me to elaborate much on my time back then. I don't think either of my employers would be too keen on recounting all that. Nor will they like what I'm doing now, but for the sake of compilation. I'm writing my jobs down from now on. You see, from 9 to 5, I do nothing but wait until some poor animal's day is up, until time or nature kills it. Once that shift ends, though, I sit by my radio and wait. Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, until I hear faint static kick in and give me the location, situation, and the cryptid I'd be hunting that evening. You've no doubt heard stories of some of the cryptids you can come across. Some are even famous. For every cryptid you've heard of, there's 10 more waiting in the bushes. Those are the ones that I'm called to take care of. Not all of them are out to harm humans, and some can exist peacefully with the surrounding ecosystems. But when one goes rogue or harms their biome, that's when I'm called in. Tonight I was called in to take care of a swift bastard called the Mild Wolf. They all have cute nicknames like that. The Mild Wolf was once thought to be in a rare category of cryptids that were singular in nature, meaning it was only one of its kind. It wasn't until 2 attacks were sighted 10 miles apart in the time frame of 5 minutes. These things are fast, but not that fast. Thank God. They're agile and cunning, so when one is spotted, it becomes a priority. They attack humans for food, and seemingly for sport, and also feed on any species of wolf that happens to habitate the area. The attacks resemble that of a pack of wolves, with how vicious the claw and bite marks can be. So after receiving the call, I made my way to the cold storage where I kept any clean roadkill and pulled the deer from the freezer. Heavy bastard. I located the sighting on a map, some backwoods or a car path that was primarily used by lost foreigners. It had one way in and out, making it a perfect road to plot a trap on. So that's what I did. Then after gathering the necessary supplies, I chucked everything into the truck bed and took off. By the time I finally hit the road, the sun had long since left the sky and it was approaching midnight. This is typically the best time for hunts. The fewer people, the better. But if you wait too long, you risk the thing hauling up for the night. Mild wolves are very adept at making themselves invisible, and can even trick passing observers into thinking they're just witnessing a normal wolf. The mild wolf gets its name from its body structure. If you were looking at it head on, all you would see is a very tall wolf. Its legs are thin and stretched, giving a malnourished appearance. Their height could dwarf the extinct dire wolves. I've heard of mild wolves that have reached up to 6 feet in height. I'm thankful I've never seen one of those. The community is still split on whether or not mild wolves have a hierarchy like regular packs do. If they do, though, that 6-footer was no doubt the alpha. Their tall stature isn't their main feature. No, it gets weirder. The mild wolf will rarely be seen from the side, but if you were to catch a glimpse, you would see a long, cylindrical-like stomach and chest. They've been compared to snakes and worms, but I see a stronger resemblance to ferrets. They can reach over 10 feet in length, and you can tell they're hungry and the middle of their tube-like body is sagging. If that's something you manage to see, it's already too late for you. As I've said before, these suckers are fast. It doesn't matter if they're running away or towards you. They are faster. Their bodies allow them to slink through the forest as if they were made of water. If you wanted to kill one, you'd have to do so swiftly, but even that wouldn't be easy. For whatever reason, all these cryptids have accelerated healing, and the mild wolf is among the worst of them. Like the worms they resemble, a limb or even half of its body will begin to regrow after being severed. There is one thing that can halt the healing completely, and it's far too cliché for my taste, but it's got the job done. Going over the plan in my head, I pulled up to my destination, about halfway through the secluded trail, and turned the truck off. I withdrew several small speakers from the back of the truck and placed them at the random positions on the road. On the side of the road, I placed a uniform row of rusty iron and covered them with leaves. Mild wolves will not make a sound as they approach you. If you are hunting one, you must act fast and quiet, or the tables will turn before you even realize you're drawing your last breath. Their teeth are some of the sharpest I've ever seen. They would slice through a tree faster than a chainsaw if one had the mind to do so. Reaching into my truck, I pulled the double-barrel shotgun I bought my first day on this job. It and Elvis got together well. Then my hands found the revolver and dropped a single, very expensive bullet into the chamber. I placed them both on the road, laying them gently next to a ghillie suit. Then the final piece was dragged from the truck bed. Several space heaters were focused on the deer. The stench it gave off was horrendous, but it was powerful, and I didn't have time to pay it mind. I placed it in the road, a safe distance from the speakers, iron, and my own supplies. With a hunting knife, I stuck the deer's stomach and pulled, the fine skin giving way easily. I felt a flow of red run past my hands. Quickly, I rushed to the open door of my truck and took one last heavy breath, just to center myself. My hand pressed hard on the car's steering wheel, and the horn cried loud into the vast silence of the night, bouncing through the trees. Slamming the door, I swiftly made my way to the ghillie suit, and threw myself under it. I laid on the road, watching the deer's body lying in the road. Moonlight as my only source of light, I could see it reflecting off the pool now surrounding the deer. Mild wolves are cautious. I had no doubt that it was sizing up the deer. I had no doubt it wanted the easy prey. Before I knew it, a shadow lunged onto the lifeless deer carcass. Ugly sounds of gnawing, like ripping sheets of paper, could be heard coming from the mass of meat. My fingers wrapped around the grip of my shotgun. There was going to be no opening. I was just going to have to go for it and hope everything worked out. You have to take leaps of faith like that a lot in my line of work. Going over the plan one more time in my head, I readied and calmed myself. It was time. Like a maniac, I sprung from under the ghillie suit and readied my shotgun. Before I even raised the barrel, it was already aware of me. Its long, slender body began contorting to face me. I didn't have the time, so without a clear shot, I pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred me for a minute, but I could see I did some damage to its legs. The mild wolf swung away from me after being shot. It was attempting to flee. It made it several feet, and a large hum emitted from one of the speakers, frightening the mild wolf. As it picked a new direction, another speaker went off. It made a frantic sprint towards my truck. My finger clicked a small rubber button on my keys, and the lights of the truck shined bright, piercing through the darkness. The road lit up. I could now see the mild wolf's albino white hair that was standing on end, like it was a pissed-off cat. Along with the lights, the radio and the speakers mounted atop good old Elvis chimed a wonderful tune of harsh static. The mild wolf retched and ran towards the side of the road. The biggest part of this job is having foresight. You are hunting the things that go bump in the night. Most of them are still animals, though, and their actions can be predicted. As I watched the mild wolf clamber to the side of the road, and as I heard the harsh clamping of the row of bear traps, I knew I was chalking up another successful hunt. The thing's frantic movements had been its undoing. If just one or two of its legs had been caught, it could have gnawed them off and I'd have no chance of catching up. But it had slipped, and the traps closed in on its stomach and near just below its neck. As I walked over, I pulled out the revolver. If left be, this thing would recover and be angrier than ever. It looked up at me and flashed bright green eyes, giving off several cries for mercy. But the mild wolf is crafty. If you show it mercy, it will not return the favor. I had more than enough time. I aimed up the perfect shot, and with the pull of the trigger, the hammer brought down and ejected the bullet. A gleaming oval of silver flew from the barrel and straight into the mild wolf's head. The only way to really kill one of these is to stop the regeneration completely. Silver is the cheapest compound known to do such a thing. Still, it ain't cheap. The rest is no different from my morning job, just a little more intimate. I removed the traps and threw the corpse into the back of my truck, covering it with the ghillie suit. and after packing up all my supplies, I hopped in and began the long drive home. I am tired, but I am alive, and there is a very long wolf hanging in cold storage. I keep the cryptid bodies around for a while too, before burying them, because just like the roadkill, they have their purpose to serve too. It's hard to keep a social life with a job like this. Never mind not having the time between both occupations. Trying to wipe the scent of dead roadkill or some creature's blood off isn't an easy task. I honestly make good money, but I'm not sure what I'm making it for. My routine is to wake up and try my best to acquire some semblance of fresh. I'll go a couple of rounds with the punching bag. Sometimes I'll just sit and look at it. Memories can be draining. Some people work so that they can live. More and more I'm discovering that I'm living to work. I find more comfort in the rides too, more than I do sitting in the house. I won't beat around the bush either. There are nights after a rough hunt that leave me feeling like a badass, and I miss that feeling. As far as the 9 to 5 goes, it was a fairly slow day. I was even called to 2 separate places that ended up being just sick animals. I have to contact animal control in those scenarios, and then it's out of my hands. There was a skunk discarded into the brush off the interstate that a number of drivers were complaining about. The smell wasn't all that bad. Lord knows I've experienced worse. Squatting over the poor thing, I observed its wounds and considered what could have inflicted them, and ignored the skunk's defense mechanisms. Most cryptids you will run across have their senses enhanced, as they've evolved to avoid detection and hunt more dangerous prey. If I wanted to find out the cause of the skunk's death, I would have to open it up, and that just wasn't going to happen. As I picked it up, however, it felt light, and its bones had clearly been cracked. Throwing it into the truck bed, I thought of the colossal viper, a massive snake that is able to, through sheer muscle power, burrow underground. It's presumed to either lack the ability to smell or deny it as a repellent. It will constrict its prey and pull its blood out using its fangs. The sheer strength of the thing would leave any animal broken. Wouldn't be too outlandish to assume I'd be getting a call about it in the near future. If it came as close as it did to civilization, it could be a problem. How would I deal with something like that monstrosity? Lucky for me, my prey this night was something a little more docile and smaller than some Hollywood horror snake. I took the day's work and disposed of whatever I couldn't use, but the skunk went into storage. Its smell could be useful in the future. Waste not and such. I got a call from my employer a few hours after getting home. It was a simple job, one that, if finished quickly enough, would allow me to take another. There are little creatures called jobbins. I didn't name them. I have no idea where the name came from. They're as peaceful as a cryptid can be. They are almost kind, in fact. You see, they'll sing for you. It's not a song you will enjoy, and for one reason or another, it'll enable you to enter sleep. Or if you're already sleeping, you'll be unable to wake up. Something about the frequency locking your brain's state of awake. They are easy to get rid of. You just have to make them know their presence is unwelcome. The reason I was even called in for this is the caveat that comes with jobbins. They are so docile that they are easy pickings for larger prey, mainly cryptids. So when the big boys hear the jobbins singing, they will culminate on the area in search of them. Even the apex of the cryptids can't resist their call. Makes you wonder what they taste like. I can tell you now, if the jobbins were to attract the attention of the ever-elusive BF, I'd be going radio silent for a few days. That is one job I'm not willing to take. My rule is, if something can chuck a tree at me, I'm going to avoid it. So like any rational hunter, this is a job I jumped on quick. Easy money, no fuss. I drove until I saw the distinct red light the jobbins give off. The best visual I can give you is, imagine large, red lightning bugs with tiny little feelers. Their singing is created by the rapid movement of their wings. God, is it annoying to hear a whole cluster of them. I wrapped a towel around the nearest branch I could find and doused it in lighter fluid with a dab of vanilla extract. It has to be straight from the bean, nothing artificial. Lighting it on fire, I made my way to the group, waving it around like I was trying to knock down some cobwebs. The group of Jobbins sang louder as they scattered into the woods. I'd have to leave the stick burning on the ground in case they returned. Smelled a bit like homemade cookies. Life would be much easier if each hunt exhibited the same degree of simplicity. It was actually pretty, watching their lights dance into the darkness. These creatures used to be a larger concern. People would mistake the glow of their bodies for the glowing of red eyes peering at them. They believed the song to be some howl to call a pact or to signify that they had found dinner. Nope, just very large bugs. I stuck around the site, sitting in my truck to make sure that nothing unsavory had followed the group of Jobbins. Thankfully, I was able to leave that site without any incident. My next call came through the radio as I was leaving the site. The place was several dozen miles out, and I'd be cutting it close with the morning light. Luck so had it that I don't work my morning job tomorrow, and this cryptid is a very hyper one, to a fault. So I shifted Elvis into gear and made my way. Guided my headlights, I watched the side of the roads. Not only did I want to avoid causing roadkill, knowing what a pain in the ass it is, but a lot of the more dangerous fellows will attack cars when they're as alone as I was. A handful of hours passed before I reached my destination. Another stroke of luck was that the general supplies I had were enough to handle this hunt, so I didn't need to stop at home. I rolled up on a farmer's driveway. Hopping out, I was greeted with a thick and commanding voice. This man had been tending to the farm since he was 18. A worn and weathered face relayed to me those youthful days was many years ago. He informed me that he saw a small creature in his field, and that it was leaving barren circles of corn. We normally don't discuss with clients unless their information is pertinent, but some of the tough-stomach ones don't mind a quick conversation. I assured him I'd take care of it and even jested that I'd try to avoid setting the field on fire. He told me that would be ideal and gave me a brief history of the cryptid's activities. With that, I headed out into the field, supplies in tow. The small beam of my flashlight attempted to illuminate my way, but it seemed every ray was met by the cornstalk's resistance. It was hard to keep track of time. The field was so monotonous and the sky was still so dark. I had at least a good 2 hours before sunlight. I was pleased to make such good timing. During my walk, I made sure to note the location of the clearings the farmer mentioned. After passing my third one, I heard a clicking noise to my right, and at this time, slowed my pace and flicked my flashlight off. Brushing aside stalks of corn as gently as I possibly could, I closed in on the rapid click. It's the same noise you'd get smacking dominoes together. The noise wasn't incredibly loud. Even as I stood just a few feet from it, I could see its outline through the obstructing vegetation. The furball was chewing away on a stalk of corn, devouring it from the bottom up. The less aggressive of cryptids tend to get names that lean towards cute. This is to sway the community's opinion on them. Things like jobbins, sugar creeps, and this here furball are typically herbivores. On rare occasions, however, a furball can become territorial if it finds a bountiful food source, like the one we were in. Even though I had become still, it halted its feeding and became aware of me. Furballs have an unparalleled sense of sight. Looking at me, the thing could see me just as clear as if the sun were directly above us, while all I could see was a tangle of outreaching thin tendrils that made up its hair. A furball. I could see the stalk of corn being clutched by its short stick limbs. It wasn't going to take long before it lunged at me. Furballs are typically harmless, but this one has been terrorizing the livestock in the farmer's daily operations, not to mention ruining large plots of the crop by eating them. They aren't something I can just put a bullet into. Their bodies are 90% hair. Even the limbs are made from longer, harder fibers of hair. I'd only get one shot before it scurried off, and I wouldn't be able to trap it like my last hunt. No, this one was going to be trying to chase me. Quickly, I flickered my flashlight in its direction to agitate it and began to run away. I could hear the tumbling line of dominoes as its short legs paddled after me. Furballs are bundles of energy, just as much as they are fluff. Their movements are sporadic and unpredictable. Whenever it caught up, it would jump across my path and take a swing at my legs, or get brazen and leap to my chest. I had to wince and ignore the slicing of flesh whenever it managed to land a hit on me. I was sure to wear something loose to snag its attacks. Foresight. It only came up to about my thighs with its height, so most of the strikes were around my ankle. It felt like running through an upset rose bush. I continued though. If I stopped, I'd get the worst of it for sure, so my arms and legs kept pumping, cool air pressing my wounds. Just when I thought my knees might buckle under the strain and minor blood loss, which I've never been good with, go figure, we came across a large circular clearing where all the stalks had been ripped up and eaten for the furball's dangerously high metabolism. Reaching into the pocket of my blue jeans, I pulled out a pill bottle-sized cylinder of metal. My finger reached into the metal pin and pulled it loose. Straining my body as much as I could, I whipped the stun grenade high above the cornfield. I hoped it was far enough to avoid any ignition. Once thrown, I spun around and threw myself to the ground, burying my face in what was left of the cornstalks and pulling my shirt over my eyes. Even with all that, and my eyes squeezed tight, my eyelids still illuminated a bright pink, and my ears still rang heavy from the blast. I'd be sure to apologize to the farmer for stirring his livestock. My issues were nothing compared to the furball's hypersensitive eyesight. It would be rendered useless for a good while. When you have something as efficient as the furball's eyes are, you tend to lean on it. That and its energy was spent chasing, and it didn't have enough energy to even try stumbling away in some haphazard direction. The quickest and most painless way for me to kill it was by just letting it starve. They have to eat pretty consistently, or their active metabolism shuts down in around 30 minutes, and dissolves what little muscle mass they have. It sounds terrible, but it really is a quiet way for them to pass on, and if I have the choice, that's the one I go with. I've heard enough horror stories about hunters that like to play with their hunts, drag it out. That's not who I am. So I sat with it, watching its fur swaying with each gust that rushed through the cornfield, accompanied by a soft rustling. As its body was shutting down and the arms and legs began to unravel and resemble the rest of its hair, the sun was coming up by then, and I had actually forgotten their fur is brown, not black like the night suggests. When its body had given up searching for fuel, I watched its hair separate from the form and drift into the morning's wind until nothing was left. Nothing but its eyes, the only part of its functioning body that wasn't in some manner made up of hair. I don't like killing most of the cryptids I come across. Hell, if there was more peaceful solutions, I would pursue them. Cryptids, they end up taking people from their family, one way or another. Even the jobbins can keep someone asleep so long that the body gives up, similar to the furball that had been across from me. I have to stop these situations before they occur. I once lacked foresight, but no longer. I cleaned up the scene. Ears still ringing, I placed the furball's glass-like eyes into a plastic bag. They would be iced in the cooler. Couldn't help but notice the clearing looked a damn lot like a crop circle. Aliens. What a joke. Typing all these cryptids' names reminded me I haven't really introduced myself yet. My name is Jack. Some cryptids are only classified as such for sake of convenience. There are several categories you'll come across. Physical cryptids are your most common. That's where you get your Mile Wolves and your Loch Ness Monsters. This category makes up the majority of my calls, but almost all of them can be killed with minimal contact. Then you have intangible cryptids. You could technically call these things ghosts, but they are just a subset of creatures that seem to exist without a form. I've only ever had to deal with one of these. It was shortly after I first began this job. I was called to the suburbs to a nuclear family's ranch house. When I arrived, the scene looked like it was straight out of The Exorcist. All their belongings were thrown to the ground, and parts of the walls were dented. The kids were beside themselves. It was the lichen collie. A very interesting study. It creeps the notion of its existence into an underdeveloped mind, mostly children. Slowly, it manipulates more and more around the child, until they are either convinced they have an imaginary friend, or they believe a monster is in their closet. From there, it can begin attempting to manifest itself in a more physical plane. Some of these guys will make you question the world around you, but it's a slippery slope and one I avoid. These type of cryptids require more out-of-the-box solutions. For example, while the mother pulled her children from the house to avoid the lichen collie, me and the father put on a show. The lichen collie always appears the same, no matter the host. It shows itself initially as a yellow teddy bear, but as the child interacts with the lichen collie, the bear will stretch. Its limbs contort in a sick attempt to imitate a human form, and its button eyes sink deep into the plush skull. The bear's skin will turn from a bright, vibrant yellow to a dirty tan. Its fur will be matted and ripped off in patches. Before I arrived at the house, I had stitched together a bodysuit that resembled the lichen collie as much as it could. I'm no tailor, but it was enough. I pulled the suit on and walked by a few windows to show the children I was inside the house. I made my way to the front door and stepped out. Doing my best impression of a thoughtless form, I walked down the sidewalk. The children were crying and begging for their mother to run with them. Just as one of the children were about to take off, the father tackled me from behind and slammed me onto the pavement. I told him to sell it, but the bruise from hitting the sidewalk remained on my elbow for what felt like weeks. He spouted lines about how I would never scare his family again, and how I was going to jail for a long time. The bear mask I had made was then pulled off, revealing my face to the children. Staring at the little girl, I could see the gears turning. The bear she had been seeing wasn't some psychic vampire. It was just some weirdo in a costume who was going to jail for the rest of their life. She was no longer convinced the lichen collie was anything more than that, and as such, it would vanish from her thoughts. Other cryptids act similar to the lichen collie, but do so in more of an immediate physical fashion. These are affliction cryptids. In this category are things like fast jackets, hornet doves, and the Calvier contaminant. Very few things can shut down an entire mile radius as the Calvier contaminant can, and that was the subject of my call tonight. For a rare night, I wasn't going to need much physical prowess to deal with a cryptid. So after I had obsessively treated my wounds, furballs can be dirty little things, I started preparing for the hunt. Although, cleanse would be a more accurate word. The call had informed me the inner city had several blocks shut down and under quarantine. Victims were reporting advanced flu-like symptoms, and their skin was showing signs of rapid decay at a cellular level. Sightings of bizarre animal behavior and appearance were also a cause for concern. Me and my employer knew that simply quarantining the area wouldn't suffice. All it would take is one rat slipping out to infect another area. I threw on a heavy hazmat suit and headed out. The more time I wasted, the more I risked a citywide infection. Like I said, Elvis can haul ass, and with me driving the roads as much as I do every day, I have pretty good intuition on which ones I can press the pedal down on. Elvis roared down the side streets. I didn't bother checking the side of the road. If something wanted to jump out at me, Elvis would be sure to take care of it. The bag of supplies resting on the passenger's seat rattled and clanged with every bump Elvis took on. I don't normally venture too far into the city. I used to, though. Years ago, I would spend entire weekends just fooling around. That life is something I've had to leave far behind, and memories of it served me little purpose, but at the very least, I knew where I was going. I'd find the afflicted area shortly after entering the city. It wasn't hard to spot all the yellow tape and no entry signs littered around. I parked a few blocks away. Before leaving, I had scrubbed the hell out of Elvis. He looked cleaner than the day I bought him. If there was even a hair of something that was once organic around the infection site, then I would just cause more problems than I solved. The place was in a complete shutdown. Even the streetlights had been shut off. The city must have blacked out part of its grid, which was smart. Sounds and lights could attract things like insects, things the Calvier contaminant absolutely love. Carefully, I made my way from building to building, trying to find the source of the contaminant. This affliction cryptid worked similarly to the hive mind of bees. If it weren't for that, it would probably be an extinction-level cryptid running rampant from state to state. Unfortunately, there is no known cure other than shutting down the hive mind before it takes too many victims. The source will send out a mist of spores that will attach to any organic life and start to absorb it for energy that will then be converted into more spores. The whole quarantine zone had a thick green hue to it, as though I was swimming through swamp water. I could see the semi-intelligent spores swirling from house to house. As I was, they were looking for a meal. The Calvira contaminant was aware of my presence, and as the cloud grew ever so thick around me, the spores were looking for any imperfection in the suit. I could hear rats and other small critters scurrying about. I came across one such rat convulsing in the corner of a shut-down mini-mart. Its skin was being eaten away in several spots, revealing its bones and inner workings. Each hole was outlined by an almost neon green light. As the contaminant eats away, it glows from the energy it receives. This, however, was not the host, so I moved on. Buildings were either completely vacant or had small animals I would have to stop and observe. If they were small enough, I could just move on, but anything that could host the membrane would have to be examined. This includes getting really up close and personal with the inflicted and cutting it open to get a good look. Or if the decay was severe enough, I could just tell from a glance that nothing abnormal was inside. I knew people were sick and on the verge of death, so I tried to hurry, but something as simple as tripping up or snagging my suit on a loose nail would cause the whole hunt to be a bust. After a few blocks had been cleared, I was convinced I had missed something or just wasn't thorough enough with what I did come across. I only had a few houses left. I figured I could clear them and just double back. I found something rather unexpected. The decaying body of another cryptid was being converted to energy. It was just laying on the sidewalk. Another mile wolf laid at my feet. This one smaller than the last by at least a foot. I cursed myself for not bringing the revolver from my truck so I could give this thing a swift death, or a death at all. Until I clear the contaminant source, this one would have to suffer the waging war of its regeneration and Calvira's feeding process. At least the virus didn't latch onto the Mile Wolf. The Calvira contaminant has a nasty habit of making its epicenter host somewhat immortal. As I stood observing the Mile Wolf, not wanting to get too close in case it had enough energy to spring up and attack the nearest piece of meat, I heard a familiar clacking in the street behind me. Slowly, I turned to face what I swiftly knew to be the epicenter host. The large adult buck before me stood with a vapor of green spores pluming from its wounds. The buck stared at me like I had my high beams on, its ears twitching at every scuff I made moving forward. I had no idea how I was expected to handle something so massive and powerful, let alone get to the source inside it. I could just barely see it as I carefully approached the buck. Inside one of the open sores adorning the massive buck's stomach was an obnoxiously green, tumorous mass clinging to the buck's intestinal tract. The virus needed to be soaked in a flammable delivery of antibiotics, heavy ones, which needed to be set aflame by direct contact with an open flame. How I was going to do any of this was beyond me. Every time I closed in, the buck would turn and gain several more feet of distances between us, which was honestly more favorable than the muscled Goliath goring me through with its massive antlers. They were intricate and imposing. This guy was for sure an alpha male. Poor thing. My attempts at a peaceful approach weren't working, and I was running out of time. The people in hospital beds were running out of time. Those around them that didn't know the infected were exhaling clouds of spores so small in numbers they were barely visible, were running out of time. I knew something about my appearance was throwing it off. I knew what that something was. It wasn't hostile towards me, but it was cautious of something it didn't know. Any attempt to speed up was no doubt going to result in the buck just trotting off. The virus has no effect on the host's cognitive functions, so the buck was going to act how it always had. It's sights like this that one that eats away at me. Such a proud and strong member of the ecosystem was reduced to nothing but a carrier, its skin a patchwork of brown and green linings, its neck only minutes away from being unable to support the weight of its antlers. Sometimes on this job, you have to forsake every safety measure you have built up. You have to take a gentle approach, like putting on a show to let a little girl know the bad man is gone. Sometimes you have to be the bad man. I clasped my hands together around the hood of my hazmat suit, once white, now stained a deep green with the patches of spores stuck to it. Lifting up, I felt the spore-filled air swirling around my head. Every inhale felt like I was breathing in soup. I tore away at the rest of my suit until I was standing in just my t-shirt and jeans. The virus was in me now, filling every organ and pore the spores could wiggle their way into. It was warm, and within moments the spores would begin feeding. Luckily, the lining of human organs is tougher for them to get through, so I had a little time before irreversible damage occurred. Cautiously stepping forward with an outstretched arm, I closed the gap between me and Patient Zero. Its body made the motions to turn, but with a few clicks, like I was calling a cat. I acquired its attention until I could see my reflection in its eyes. Gently, I brushed what patches of intact fur I could find until the buck was motionless. Freehand grabbing the bottle of liquid, I continued soothing the buck. The lid slipped off and the antibiotics applied directly to green mass. Best efforts were kept to keep the liquid from directly impacting the buck's remaining nerves. It would surely set the beast off. I had forgotten the flare. It was taped to the hazmat suit. I backed up, clicking once more, and the buck, thank God, it followed me. We danced together until I felt the suit at my feet. Kneeling down, I picked up the red flare and cracked it. A bright red cast its light on me and the buck. Then the light disappeared as it was being shoved into the Calvier contaminant. Sparks of it would flick and burn into my hand, but I had to remain steady until the flare burned out. It was reacting with the antibiotics, stripping its exterior of the vicious liquid that caused the infection, and boiling the interior until all the spores had turned into an inactive mush. Shortly after the buck dropped to the ground, its antlers smacking against the pavement, the green spores around me began dropping, just the same. I felt bad for the buck. I really did, but if you need some solace, I could see that not even the virus was able to eat away at its impressive show of antlers. Body feeling like hell, like it did back when I would have to go 10 rounds in more than just a punching bag. I grabbed the suit, now completely useless, and pulled the green mess from inside the buck. It was dormant now, but inside the slush of spores was a highly potent poison. Might be useful with handling future cryptids. I then made my way to the truck. The authorities would discover on their own that the area was clear, and I'd be called in the morning to remove the animals. I'd have done it tonight, but my energy was quite literally drained. When I arrived at the truck, I noticed that its driver's side door had been left completely open, which is something my neurotic mind would never do. I searched the interior and found nothing missing, until on a whim, I checked where I stored my revolver. Instead of a shining metal handgun, I was left with a small silver pellet, one I had forgotten to recover from the mild wolf hunt. I know when to leave a situation, and when I happened to glance at my passenger side window to see a distant pair of yellow orbs watching me, I left the scene. Even on the drive home, I could see the same pair of yellow eyes every few miles. Once I got home, on my doorstep was a shining metal revolver, or as I now saw it, a warning. As children, we've all had our share of strange rituals, traditions, beliefs, and so forth. Some were stemmed from what we were convinced would bring good fortune or ward off bad luck. Others were born from curiosities regarding the mystical and sometimes morbid. But perhaps the most common were the ones that emerged from our childhood fears. Our overactive imaginations would lead to what-if scenarios involving alien invasions, giant monsters, ghosts, and all manner of disasters of the fantastical scale. But, as adults, we no longer need to worry about such irrational fears, right? Well, what if I told you that wasn't the case? That perhaps what we feared as children may not have been so irrational after all? What if I told you there are things that go bump in the night? Most are generally harmless, but others are just waiting for the right opportunity to rip you apart, devour your bones, or even do the unspeakable to your flesh. Fortunately, I've managed to compile this guide on a few of the more notable creepy crawlies out there, and how to best deal with them. If you're lucky, and do as instructed, you may survive for another day. Keep in mind, nothing is certain, and nothing is guaranteed. Best of luck, and sleep well. Number 1. The Monster Under the Bed. Perhaps the most well-known and documented of these creatures is commonly referred to as the monster under the bed. True to its name, it generally dwells under the bed frames and mattresses. It tends to prefer the beds of children, due to children having a more messy lifestyle. The monster will gather discarded and dropped items and pull them under the bed to build a nest. An opportunistic scavenger, the monster's diet consists of whatever food scraps it can find when it emerges from its nest at night to feed. It can flatten its body due to having an extremely flexible skeletal system. When standing at full height, it is approximately 7 feet tall. The creature is dark gray in appearance with 6 limbs. It lacks visible eyes and relies on smell, touch, and hearing to navigate. Its head and back are covered in what appears to be long hair, at first, but are really tendril-like appendages covered in fine black sensory hairs. The monster has 3 prehensile tails. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the monster is its jaws. When threatened, it can open its jaws in several directions, like a flower or an umbrella. The inside of these jaws are lined with hook-shaped bony protrusions, which are also located in the creature's throat. They are thought to tear food into smaller and easier to swallow chunks, as well as for defense purposes. Although it prefers to avoid people, it will lash out and attack people to defend its territory. This can lead to severe injury and even death. It is best to move quickly and quietly while getting in and out of bed as to not provoke the creature. If necessary, it is also possible to offer your left sock as a means to appease the monster and prevent it from attacking you. Number 2. The Phantom Unicorn. Very little is known about this elusive creature. Sightings of it are few and far between, and no one has yet to have gotten a good glimpse of it. What few eyewitness accounts of the Phantom Unicorn there are describe a semi-transparent entity that vaguely resembles a horse-like shadow with a yellow horn and red eyes. All of these accounts also state that the creature was always within their peripheral vision, and that it would immediately move out of their line of sight the moment they attempted to get a direct look at it. Likewise, those who attempted to look directly at the Phantom Unicorn later found themselves suffering from severe night terrors and paranoia. These symptoms, however, did wear off after a few days. Because of this, it is very important to never attempt direct eye contact with the unicorn. Likewise, due to its mysterious and unpredictable nature, it is also important to avoid engaging it in any sort of conflict. If at any moment you do see a glimpse of the unicorn in your peripheral vision, the best course of action is to simply ignore it. Number 3. The Cat Lizards. These beings are primarily found in rural areas. They are social beings resembling bipedal, gecko-like creatures with green skin, a yellow underbelly, and yellow spots. Cat lizards have large black eyes and pointed cat-like ears on their heads. A distinctive feature they have is the anglerfish escape lure on their heads, which ends in a bulbous growth capable of emitting light. It is thought this appendage is used for both communication and to lure in insects, their primary source of food. Fully standing, a cat lizard is approximately 2 feet tall. Close-up sightings of a cat lizard are uncommon. Most encounters with these beings often are from a distance, with eyewitnesses describing strange lights moving in the distance. Cat lizards are nocturnal, which explains why most sightings occur at night. Because they prefer to avoid human contact, cat lizards are generally not a threat. However, should you encounter one, a flashlight is a good deterrent. Their eyes are very sensitive to light. Likewise, making loud noises are also effective at driving them away due to their sensitive hearing. It is strongly discouraged that you chase them. Cat lizards are intelligent enough to use primitive tools and will band together in small groups to fight back, using sharpened sticks and rocks to defend themselves. Number 4. The Lady in White. Unlike other entries in this list, the Lady in White is known to be actively malicious towards others. Because of this, extreme caution must be taken when going against her. Descriptions vary greatly regarding sightings of the lady. Her age, ethnicity, and so forth differ from one eyewitness account to the next. However, a few aspects of her remain constant. For one thing, she is often described wearing a flowing white gown. The gown is also said to always be in impeccable condition, regardless of environmental circumstances around her. Likewise, the gown is said to never tear, rip, or stain, no matter how bloody of a struggle she ends up in. The other main feature that remains constant is her voice. She is said to speak in a soft, compelling voice, which eyewitnesses have also noted her voice never changes from a calm tone. The Lady in White often appears in dreams and without warning. She will often tell the person dreaming to follow her. Often the dreamer will feel a sudden urge to go after the woman. After this, she will appear more often before the dreamer. Each time, she will be more and more insistent, while maintaining an unusually calm tone of voice, that they follow her. As these dreams become more frequent, the dreamer will experience increased feelings of dread, unease, and paranoia. This will eventually lead to severe night terrors. Victims have also developed acute cases of insomnia as a psychological means to avoid encountering her in their dreams. Those who are fortunate enough to escape her grasp are said to endure these night terrors and chronic insomnia for the rest of their lives. The unlucky ones, however, are often found dead in their rooms. So far, it is unknown how she kills her victims, though they seem to suffer from acute cardiac arrest beforehand. If she appears before you, your best course of action is to wake up immediately before she gets a chance to tell you to follow her. Otherwise, it may be too late. Number 5. The Bear Reporter. The Bear Reporter is another being who tends to appear in people's dreams. However, he never directly interacts with the dreamer. He is often seen in the background of dreams, and rarely do people see him up close. The Bear Reporter appears to be a male in his 30s or 40s, wearing a suit and tie. He is generally sitting behind a desk, typical of that for news broadcasts, though he does occasionally show up for on-the-scene reports. However, his most distinctive feature, and the reason for his namesake, is that he appears to have the head of a common black bear. Said head also has deer-like antlers. Oddly enough, the mouth never appears to move while the Bear Reporter is talking. Likewise, the eyes appear to be empty black sockets. This has led some to believe that the head is simply some sort of mask. However, there doesn't appear to be any seams or whatnot, indicating it may actually be the Bear Reporter's head. Since the Bear Reporter never directly interacts with those who dream about him, his motives and nature are unknown. Those that have dreamed about him later experienced vivid hallucinations. These hallucinations generally involve the Bear Reporter suddenly appearing for a brief moment before vanishing almost as quickly. Other incidents involve people claiming that they heard phrases such as local story or live from insert the town here in his voice, only for it to fade away as they tried to get closer to it. Currently, there are no known ways to deal with the Bear Reporter. Number 6. Mr. Bones. Mr. Bones is a humanoid entity that can sometimes be seen roaming at night. He is approximately 6 feet tall and appears to be of average human proportions. The most distinguishing feature is what gives him his namesake. You see, Mr. Bones wears a suit of armor made entirely out of the skeletal remains of various organisms. The bones of fish, birds, and even humans, among other creatures, all make up his unusual outfit. No one knows why he wears this bone armor, and no one knows what he fully looks like underneath it. Those few who manage to get a glimpse of whatever is under the armor all described it as some variation of repulsive. His presence is noted by the sounds of his bony armor rattling and scraping against whatever surface they brush against. It does not matter if you lock your doors or your windows, as he somehow always finds a way in. Once inside your house, Mr. Bones will proceed to rummage through your garbage, your fridge, and other peculiar areas of the house. This is because he's looking for bones. He needs more bones to make a new suit to replace his old, worn-out one. Of course, this means he may find his way to your bedroom. You have plenty of bones, and they'd be perfect for his new suit. Mr. Bones is a being of good manners, however. Should you see his shadow in your doorway, it is important to ask, "Who's there?" He will clear his throat, apologize for disturbing your sleep, and will leave to find another house to search for more bones for his new suit. Number 7. The Laughing Man. The Laughing Man is yet another being who appears in dreams. He is a being that appears to be a Caucasian male, human, somewhere in his 30s, and is in a perpetual state of laughter. However, his appearance also constantly distorts as if some unseen force is stretching, crushing, and twisting him in ways that should be physically impossible to perform on the human body without causing some sort of severe injury or even death. It is unknown if the Laughing Man is even aware of these distortions to his body, or even what could possibly be causing them. While no known long-term effects of encountering the Laughing Man have been documented, people have stated an immediate sense of unease once his presence is known. So far, the Laughing Man himself does not appear to pose any immediate threat. However, caution must be taken if you do end up dreaming about him. His delirious state of euphoria, contrasting with what should be agonizing distortions to his body, indicate that something is very wrong. There is the possibility that the Laughing Man is an ordinary person who had somehow found himself in some sort of catatonic state and trapped in a perpetual dream of torment. Something is causing the Laughing Man to experience these anomalies, and it may try to cause those distortions and insane laughing fits to happen to you as well. Awakening the Laughing Man, whoever he really is also not advised. It is unknown if this would result in any sort of physical or psychological trauma. Plus, it's unknown whatever is tormenting him would do if its victim were to be taken away from its grasp. Number 8. Dream Dragons. Not all things go bump in the night are malevolent, nor are all of them dangerous. Some, such as the dream dragons, can be beneficial. Dream dragons, despite the name, are not creatures that exist within dreams. Rather, they feed on dreams. These small creatures are approximately a foot in length. They are covered in dark cerulean fur, with tufts of purple fur on each side of their head. Dream dragons have 4 short limbs with 3 clawed toes on each foot. Due to their limbs being so short, they cannot travel very fast. Likewise, although they have wings, they cannot fly very fast either. However, they can hover and fly in all directions. These small reptilian creatures have large black eyes, which allow them excellent night vision, and can see in more colors than humans can. A pair of sensory organs on their head allow them to navigate in areas too dark to see. Likewise, they have large sensitive ears for hearing, and they have a keen sense of smell too. Dream dragons lack teeth. Instead, they use their long tongues to reach into the ears of sleepers and extract dreams to feed on. Since they prefer the taste of good dreams, they are known to emit a type of pheromone that induces relaxation in the sleeper. Because of this beneficial nature, it is strongly recommended to encourage these creatures to visit you while you sleep. Dream dragons are social creatures and will gather in small flocks, shelving plenty of blankets and extra pillows, or plush toys if you prefer, provide for excellent areas for them to roost, and avoid predators. It should be noted that dream dragons are not defenseless. Located on the tip of their tail is a barb that secretes venom. If threatened, they may attempt to sting you. Normally, a dream dragon's sting is painful but not serious. However, there are a rare few people who have an allergic reaction to the sting. People who suffer from this sting may experience a form of sleep paralysis. I suggest treating any dream dragons who make themselves comfortable in your home with the utmost care and respect.